Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here for you at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas, and you can find out more about us at tertiumquids.org. You can also peruse past editions of this program and learn more about our Tuesday morning group coalition that gets together in Richmond to discuss the actions we need to take as far as making policy stick. Unlike a lot of think tanks, that's where we go first. Another one of those think tanks that actually goes and puts rubber to the road is the Heritage Foundation. We do great work with them, and joining us from the Heritage Foundation, graduate fellow in welfare policy, Mimi Teixeira, is on with us this week. Good morning, Mimi. How are you doing?
I am good. Thank you for having me.
Not at all. We wanted to talk a little bit about welfare reform. We're hearing a lot about it here in Virginia because we've got a General Assembly that is discussing expanding Medicare. Now that about 30-odd states in the union have struggled with it, we've decided, hold it, maybe we can do it right. I don't know why. But a lot of lawmakers that are discussing it say, well, no, we're going to do it like welfare reform happened back in the 90s. But the president has talked about welfare reform. Catch us up on what the president wants in terms of welfare reform. We know that the president tends to speak in broad brushstrokes and then ask lawmakers to come up with an answer. So start from where he is sitting and then get into some of the nitty-gritty of what the folks on either side of the aisle are talking about in Washington. Sure.
So as you said, President Trump is a delegator, and he has asked his agencies to work on reforming welfare. So we have 89 programs across 14 agencies. He wants them to focus on these broad goals. So increase work in the program and self-sufficiency, encourage marriage and strong families, use the money efficiently and effectively, and reduce waste and fraud to serve the truly needy. What that means in policy is going to be things like work requirements, which some states have, the federal government has, but are fairly weak. Programs that will make sure that money is targeted in a way that's effective, so making sure that we fund programs that actually are successful rather than just spend money, and especially reforming programs so that they don't discourage marriage.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about fraud and waste, certainly we've seen some staggering numbers in the amount of fraud and waste that it really, if you think about somebody who's going to be a fraudster to some of these aid programs, they must be really close to the lowest of the low because they're scamming money that could be going to people who are truly needy and leaving those truly needy there wondering why does it feel like they have to plead court proceedings to get their benefits. So what kind of things are being discussed by the lawmakers that might help tighten that up and the agency heads for that kind of fraud prevention and fraud punishment?
So a few of the agencies have discussed sharing their applications. So right now you apply separately to each agency, and they don't check what you're saying to other agencies. So in some programs, you get more money if you're single. In other programs, you get more money if you have a husband who's working or a boyfriend who's working who's claiming the children for his benefits. Mm-hmm. So the biggest source of fraud is unmarried parents who, one of them is pretending to be single to get food stamps and temporary assistance for needy families, and then the father is claiming the kids. Now he's a single father and using his earnings to get the earned income tax credit. And they're making up to $6,000 or $7,000 more than they would be if they were honest. So checking across these programs, making sure that every household is the household that they say they are. They have the same number of people. They live at the same place.
Now, when we look at, and I can hear the opponents of this kind of behavior screaming about the poor, you're going to take $6,000 away from the poor. And of course, the real issue comes back down to how far in debt our government already is, the entitlement programs that have already crippled our economy, and that there's a really good chance that if we start reducing the amount of tax revenue the government has to generate every year, those folks don't have to be poor anymore because there could be more jobs out there. Is that a fair thing to say?
I think so. I mean, first, we spend $1.1 trillion a year on welfare. That's 3 times as much as we should need to eradicate poverty. So there has to be something going wrong. We do make sure that everyone has enough, but allowing this kind of fraud is the reason that people don't look for jobs, and it's the reason that people don't get married and become a part of their communities and society. So we definitely, if we reduce this spending, can have more money in our economy to invest, to create more jobs. But we also have a fairly low unemployment rate under President Trump, and we need more people to be involved in the economy and investing, and that means being stricter about waste and fraud and encouraging work.
So you said $3.2 trillion spent in poverty programs, and was that just one poverty program or in all of them?
So across all of them, it's $1.1 trillion spent
1.1.
So it's three times the amount we need to solve the need problem.
Is it fair to say that, I mean, if you divided that up by the number of folks who fell below the poverty level, you could just send them a check out of that kind of money if it wasn't for the fraudsters out there getting what they shouldn't get?
That is an idea that's been floated around. We like to think that more targeted programs make it so we can get money to the neediest people. So some programs, we have work requirements. Those are for work-capable people. We make sure that those people have an incentive to get a job that will help them become self-sufficient. We have other programs that are only for mothers with infants and children that do things like help teach parents how to properly feed an infant. We have programs that deliver groceries to elderly people. So you could send a check. We think that it might actually help reduce the amount of money that might be spent on things that are not good for people if we make sure that this money is allocated in a way that is going definitely to children and definitely to the disabled and definitely to the elderly, and then also providing temporary assistance to people who should be getting back into the labor market.
So is it possible to create a bureaucracy that does that? I mean, it seems like there's so many eddies and currents that it's hard for one person behind a desk working an 8-hour day to be that involved. And I've talked to so many folks who speak about the aid community being too centralized. Mimi Teixeira is on with us from the Heritage Foundation. She's their graduate fellow in welfare policy. Talk about the centralization of our welfare programs, and even when it's a state program, so often it's sort of block granted through federal funds anyway, and it really makes it easier because the less personal it is. You're not dealing with one caseworker as much as you're working with somebody who's at an office there for 8 hours, and if you go the next week, maybe it's a different person, and that kind of thing creates these cracks that people can fall into. Is there a way to put the money more locally so that people who are in need are speaking to somebody who lives in their community with them?
Yes, and we should be doing that. I think we should be giving broad ideas or guidelines of states that have been successful, like Maine or like Wisconsin, on welfare, but also making sure that states with different needs, because we have such a diverse country, can do things differently. The problem that we have now is that states, everyone pays the federal government, and then the federal government packages money to the states, and if they say do whatever you want with it, the states are thinking this isn't really our money. If we waste it, we can just ask for more from the federal government. There's no accountability. So if the states want more control, and they should have more control, we need to start returning funding back to the state level and hopefully back to the local level, because, as you said, people who see the same person face-to-face every day, who live in the community, in that labor area, would better understand the actual needs of the community than someone sitting in an office in D.C.
Now, I know that our tax code still contains a lot of ways that you can mitigate your tax liability for gifts to charity and that kind of thing. If you went to a tax reform where somebody could say, hey, I want this money going to women and infant children, WIC programs, or food stamps, or something like that, and under that same guise of, okay, all right, so that's money we don't need to take and put through a bureaucracy because it's already targeted funding from the taxpayer. Is that something that could be discussed, or has any sort of traction, Mimi, from where you sit?
I have not heard as much about the taxpayer choosing where money should go. I think that the taxpayers should have more control over where their money is going in these programs, especially because, some of the programs work better than others. They do, and we don't have a lot of accountability in some of these programs for actually making sure that the programs are working or reaching the people they need to reach. I think definitely a positive thing for the country would be encouraging more philanthropy, encouraging more local charities to get into this, and even creating partnerships between the federal government and local charities, local communities, so that the taxpayers see where their money is going and they can be more direct with their officials that they want more of that. They want more money in their communities to women who have infant children. They want more money in their communities to job training, whatever they need. They should definitely have more of a say in that.
Is there an issue, and it seems like we often trip ourselves up, that so many of our aid agencies have a theological underpinning, or at some point or another are part or parcel or connected to, and whether it be school choice or medical assistance, aid for seniors, we get caught up in folks who oppose, obviously, federal funding going to church groups. Is there a way around that, and is that a big hang-up, or does it just seem like that's something that catches a lot of people's eyes?
It becomes a hang-up, and it's become a hang-up especially in adoption and foster care agencies. So at least I personally think that there's room both for secular and for religious agencies that are actually serving and helping everyone in their community, which they do. I think that any political energy spent on getting rid of religious institutions or only funding secular institutions is really hurting the poor. I mean, you should never stop a charity or a good service from serving and from receiving the funds that secular charities get to serve. That seems like something that could only harm people, especially people who are searching for spiritual nourishment as well as looking for help in all of these other areas of their lives.
When you look at the overall size of the federal budget and you realize how much of this is entitlement programs, is it sustainable, Mimi, as we go forward? Is the president just saying something that sounds like a good idea? Because I've heard people with a much more dire view of where we're going in the future because of our requirements and those things that were promised, and then whether or not Congress or the presidency or the executive branch or just the bureaucracy played fast and loose with what seemed like a free pile of money, a lot of those legacy costs are not there now and not available, even when they were built on demographics that have changed, like with Social Security. That kind of legacy cost, is this fixable, or is the demagoguery that follows it going to cripple any real reform, do you think?
So we should definitely be clear that this is a problem. Entitlements right now, entitlement spending is not solvent. It's not going to last at the rate that it is going. And so there need to be reforms. It's difficult to reform, obviously, because of all of these interest groups who are involved and people who have very strong views, especially people who fearmonger amongst the elderly, which I think is really sad and hurtful. A lot of people have put out suggestions maybe to privatize parts of Social Security, to change the schedule so that the retirement age is later. There are all these ideas floating around. I think that if there's an area that we need to start being serious about being bipartisan on, entitlement reform is one of them, because there's no one saying that it's not going to be a problem. Everyone agrees that we are going to hit a cliff here, and we need to probably really start thinking about how we can change the benefits or change the demographic through the way we work in our labor market, get more people back to work so that these programs can still be available to the people my age who are promised them and who worry very seriously that we might never see this money.
Well, let me ask you then on the other side of it. Now, Bob Goodlatte, one of our Virginia congressmen, has annually brought a a balanced budget amendment to the floor, and it usually never gets anywhere, though it is getting some discussion on the floor this year. One of the concerns folks have is that that kind of balanced budget amendment, especially as his, if I remember it correctly, has a connection to GDP, could cripple some of these aid programs. What do you see in that? And would just getting the fiscal house of Washington in order do enough to stimulate the economy? Do you have to do that first before you balance the budget, so as to not leave the working poor and those who are out of work without any recourse?
I don't think that the balanced budget amendment is the perfect idea, but I think it's getting at the right idea. So when we look at how states run their governments, they might go into debt for a few years, but because of the way that they're run and the way that they get their funding, they always make sure that they eventually get back in the black and that they're being financially responsible. It would be helpful for the U.S. to start taking real steps to get our budget closer to a balanced budget.
Mm-hmm.
I think that having a balanced budget amendment right now would probably scare the economy in a way that I don't think would be positive. But it's getting at this idea, this very real idea that we do need to be more fiscally responsible if we want to have a strong economy, and we need to have an economy that internationally people can trust, and a government that internationally people can trust, which means getting this federal debt down in as quickly and efficiently a way as possible.
Well, let me follow up on that. To take it to another level, and at an obscure level, we were talking, Mimi, I've often said that with states not having a lot of voice in Washington, that it would almost be an interesting rejiggering of the way the federal government is funded if instead of charging an income tax to each individual, the states would send almost a membership fee to the U.S. government, and each one from their own ability to contribute. There'd be a standard membership dues, if you will, model to funding the federal government. Do you think that would add or subtract from transparency and put it back on the states to at least have a say in how some of this is done?
I think it would definitely get us back to a serious version of federalism, so one where the federal government is more responsive to the states and the states have more power to direct the federal government. I think right now a lot of people feel like if they have a problem, if they want to influence their government, they go straight to the federal government. The states have lost a lot of their proper power, and that's probably a reason why the federal government's budget has gotten so out of control. The federal government's reach into the states has gotten out of control. I think that any move that would give more of that power back to the states to not only control money, but then to use that to control the way that the federal government is treating the states, is interacting with the states, would be good. So we have a system that once again, the way that it was designed, would once again have the federal government taking care of national matters like national security, interstate commerce, and states taking care of state and local matters.
Are there leaders, are there bureaucracies that are at the forefront of actually grasping this, or have they all dug their heels in and are going to fight the president like we've seen most of the swamp fight the president on these reforms?
We have quite the entrenched bureaucracy, but I do think that there are people in the current administration who are really serious about returning power to the states and about decreasing spending, using money as efficiently and effectively as possible, and about reining in some of these programs that maybe they're seeing are wasteful and full of fraud. The president has surrounded himself with good people, and so I think there is cause for hope here.
So his advisors are giving him good metrics towards this, and is the president, as it seems to be, approaching this as you would an enterprise? You don't want a business running out of money. There have been some of those who oppose the president say, well, he's used to just running a business until he declares bankruptcy, and you can't do that with the United States. But you don't seem to be sharing that view from where you are at the Heritage Foundation.
I don't see that. I think there was, unfortunately, a very bloated, wasteful budget passed in Congress. But what I'm seeing from the president, at least in my issue area, is him being really serious about reining in spending and making sure that the taxpayers are seeing value from their money, and that if they're not, if there's areas of waste or of fraud or of abuse, that money is going back to the taxpayer. I am not seeing anything that would indicate that President Trump plans to be wasteful in this area.
Now, the executive branch has often given cover to congresspeople by often writing these blank, broad checks to these bureaucracies and say, you do this, Congress won't vote for it, et cetera, et cetera. And it seems like that the president could also give cover to congresspeople who are concerned with having to run against an opponent that says so-and-so is for dirty water and filthy air because he cut the funding of the EPA, or he's throwing grandma from the train is the favorite rhetoric. Do you think the president is ready to give cover to Congress people who do that?
Well, politics is a complicated game, as I'm sure
amen,
you've
sister.
seen. I think the president wants to make sure that the party is strong, and so I think that he might be willing to take some actions in the administration that take some of the pressure off of Congress. So there are things the administration can do that can help along the work of Congress that I think people don't realize. So reining in some of the regulations that he's already done. He's decreased a ton of federal regulations, taking some of these reforms so that the American people are seeing the good of the Republican platform, but at the same time, maybe while we're gearing up for what's probably going to be an interesting midterm, that these representatives can focus on policies that they know really matter to their constituents, things like tax reform that we just saw, and things like this farm bill, this SNAP work requirement reform that we're seeing now. I think that the best thing that he can do and what he is doing is making sure that his Congress can focus on the issues that the constituents call in about every day.
Thank you so much. It's the Heritage Foundation, heritage.org. You can read some of her writings at dailysignal.com as well. Mimi Teixeira, graduate fellow in welfare policy at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us this week and giving us a look inside this little aspect of draining the swamp and how it could impact and actually help people if we get past the demagoguery. I appreciate it, and you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. You as well.
Coming up next, Roslyn, Layton, former internet policy expert at the EU and transition team member for President Trump at the Federal Communication Commission on Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg, but moreover than that, online privacy, what you should be entitled to, and what the companies that work on the internet should be doing better. All coming up next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Joining us now, and I don't think there's a bigger story out there as people have gathered around the old gawk box and have started to really dig into the idea of internet privacy. We've talked to folks like Seton Motley, who penned a wonderful column saying if it's free on the computer, you're the product. And it's a fair thing to say, but I think there's more going on to that. So we've asked Roslyn Layton to join us. She is the former internet policy expert for the European Union and a member of the Trump transition team at no less than the Federal Communications Commission. Roslyn, thank you for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's so great to be with you. And you're right, this is a complex issue. So, and I'm glad we can talk about it today.
Absolutely. So let me begin with that first feeling that we click accept so frequently that we've seen, I believe it was an Apple product. It may have been an app creator for Apple. It may not have been Apple proper. Actually gave away $200,000 to somebody that found the a code in the middle of the user agreement, and it just said, text this code to this number and we'll send you $200,000. But he was the only one out of all the people that had downloaded the app. One person saw this free $200,000 in the middle of the app. We're very bad at reading all the fine print, but is there too much fine print for the average person to even be expected to get through that much legalese?
Well, you've actually hit at the heart of the matter, and I think this is where our regulation to date has kind of failed us, or maybe lack thereof, is that many of the lawmakers look and say, well, let's just make it explicit. We'll make it more explicit, add more conditions, right? Just explain it more in detail. But fundamentally, people don't understand what the exchange is. They don't understand that, if you are getting a service for free, you're going to have to pay in some way. Mm-hmm. And there is no such thing as free. You pay with your data. So this is going to if we want to fix this issue, we have to have user education. And right now today, no regulators in the world are recognizing that, because what it actually means is we have to empower consumers to take responsibility for what they are agreeing to. Because if you really understood what it was, you might not use the service, or you might be more skeptical, or you might not use it as much, or you might demand more restrictions. So, when you talk about this European approach, they have all these regulations, but none of them actually educate the consumer. So, if we want to fix this problem, it's up to us. It's also the companies, Congress to some extent, to say what actually is going on. And no more amount of making it more explicit or adding more words is going to solve the problem until people really understand what the exchange is about.
I had said fancifully that it would be really interesting to come down to a dollar figure. We all know what our property is worth, and if we take out a mortgage on our house, what that property is worth and what the square acreage might be worth. But when you consider how much money is trafficked in our data, and it's not even in terms of our Social Security numbers or in the dark web kind of stuff, but even just our browsing histories and our what we like to read and our reading preferences. We, the American consumer, actually contribute an awful lot of, quote, value without ever getting much in the way back for it. And I guess that's part of it, is we don't know as an educated consumer base how much we're giving in exchange for what we're getting in terms of the apps we download or the software we use. Is that a fair thing to say, Roslyn?
That's it. That's absolutely correct. And you could say, here's one of the challenges of, where economics could help us by evolving the privacy rights market, where we could see. So let's imagine if you went to Facebook and you said, well, I want to use the service, but I don't want to collect my data. Then they might offer you an option. Well, you can use Facebook for X dollars per month, or whatever the case may be. We might start to get a sense. But I would say there's another reason that this hasn't evolved, which is because the Silicon Valley companies have sort of systematically regulated away the opportunity for alternative forms of advertising. So, for example, the most important kind of advertising we'd have today would be your broadband provider could lower the cost of your broadband subscription by having Google and Facebook actually support the advertising service.
Oh,
so
I see.
They would actually pay for the bandwidth that they're using, or let's say other advertisements. So you pay out of pocket every month for your broadband subscription, but if you were able to reduce the out-of-pocket expense, you'd feel a value in that, and then you'd begin to get a sense of, the different ways to value things. And that would also drive competition in the advertising market today, which is essentially an oligopoly between Facebook and Google.
Does radio really taint that market? Here we are on, the oldest of the social medias, radio broadcast, and we've distributed this stuff for free since the 30s or the 20s, really, in exchange for commercials that pop up every now and then during the broadcast. But I think that, people have started to think that if it happens on the internet, it's free, and we really need to change that. Is that a good thing that could come out of this whole Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg's on Capitol Hill being grilled, or are you concerned that his zeal for the government to regulate him more is just his power play to become sort of an oligarch over the internet industries?
Right. Well, advertising, it goes back to Benjamin Franklin, and it is fundamental to free speech. And, we may malign advertising sometime, but it actually serves a valuable service. It provides a lot of content, and it's an important part of our American communications history. But that still being said, we still need to have a healthy conversation about it. We need to examine how it works. We need to educate ourselves about new forms of advertising, and we need to have competition in the forms of advertising. So there is no doubt that, the internet companies, they've disrupted radio, TV, print. I mean, you can add up all the radio, TV, print in the world, and it's still less than what Google and Facebook do. Mm-hmm. So they have disrupted all the other industries before them, and now it's time to disrupt them. Yeah. And if they were smart, they'd start to disrupt themselves. But if they just agree to do what, to be regulated, what that tends to do is it can actually extend their life, because then they agree to certain things and it makes it harder for new competitors to come in. I mean, again, this comes back to having more competition would be a good thing. Innovating, we could also say, let's have a competition. You talked about the thing that Apple did. Let's have a competition to create the new kind of advertising service or the new privacy-enhancing technology. How about a platform that doesn't need data to work, right? That's, in fact, Facebook did this similarly. They didn't want to have a lot of bandwidth. They wanted their service to be very light, so they innovated it. Well, you could say, well, how can you provide your service by minimizing data? And I think now there's a business opportunity. Companies will see what happened, and they will start looking at other ways about how can they differentiate in the marketplace. I hope so, and I hope we'll see some more competition.
Is that the maturing of any marketplace? Are we just watching something that naturally happens with any marketplace? There's that kind of flash of like, oh, this is cool and new, and then you sort of settle into the same business model. Hey, it cost me this much to make this, so here's what it costs for you to use it, that eventually settles out with most all free markets?
Well, you are correct that there is a maturation process, and there's you kind of see this growth, and then things start to slow. But for Facebook, for a lot of these companies' perspectives, for them, their real opportunities are in developing world because there's more people there. The purchasing power is not as high. But they're saturated in the United States and maybe in Western Europe, so they have to look in other places. But we have seen these kinds of processes before with other industries. If creative destruction, you find a new source. So the entrepreneurial interests that will say, well, how can I look at an opportunity there? That's what an entrepreneur would look for. But that doesn't take away that we're also part of it, and we have to take responsibility for how we use it, and then also think about what role does it play in our communities and so on, and say, what's the conversation here? What's the role of technology in our lives, right? There's, we had a lot of questions emerged, and there's a lot of good things, and maybe there's some things we're concerned about.
Roslyn Layton is on with us from the American Enterprise Institute, AEI.org, Internet policy expert for the EU, former, and Trump transition FCC team member as well. Roslyn, let me ask you something else that certainly has come up on this program in the past, is the idea that some of these publishers like YouTube, and certainly the horrific shooting at YouTube has brought light to the idea that they behave like a TV network now to a lot of their content creators. And the same is true. I went to the Consumer Electronics Show, and so much of the time in breakout sessions was using the, quote, influencers that have these web pages to draw marketing dollars. At what point is there a responsibility to these publishers of content or aggregators? And where is the line between a publisher and an aggregator?
Well, so what you've talked about there, one of the situations with YouTube and the broadcasters, or with the internet companies and the broadcasters, is that they're basically competing without regulation, and then the broadcasters, radio included, they have to compete with a lot of legacy regulations. Mm-hmm. Similarly, telecommunications. There are also communications platforms. There are substitutes for telephone and SMS and so on, but they don't have to comply with the same regulations. So that is a terrible situation of arbitrage, which distorts the reality. And what is important now is that we have to get everybody on the same page in terms of the regulation. Whether which my preference is we regulate down and we make a free market where all can compete, or we have to just get everybody to play by the same rules. And that is we're in a converged world. We have been for the last 50 years. It should not be news to Facebook or YouTube, that they are competing against legacy players with a lot of regulation. It should not be their opportunity to exploit it to their business advantage and, exploiting the consumer. So now this is one area where I am for regulation and legislation, at least in the sense that it stops the arbitrage.
Well, and I'm bringing up more not so much about regulation, but responsibility to the world of verifiability, I guess is what I'm saying. So if a magazine publishes something that they haven't vetted and it turns out to be untrue, they can be held accountable for that, or a TV station or a radio station. But it seems like because some of these groups like YouTube and Facebook say, we're just aggregating other people's writings, we don't have to be held to that accountable. But by using their platform, it's almost like a freelance journalist is getting a story in Time magazine and it turns out to be not true. Time would not be able to say, don't blame us for that. That was the author's issue. They would still be held accountable punitively for publishing something that was false, since that really seems to be the source of a lot of the congressional hearings into Facebook, is this Internet Research Agency and how much they manipulated our elections.
Right. Well, you're talking about this issue of intermediate liability, which to date, many would have argued that that's been part of what's fueled the Internet's growth, was that the platforms were not accountable for the content that they had. And now that view is sort of changing, is that they should be, and there is, with recent legislation about sex trafficking, that the platforms do bear some responsibility. But we have to be careful about what that means. Of course, we don't want terrorism, and we approve when Facebook removes terrorist content, but we don't like it when they censor conservative content and news. So I think that's again an important distinction to make. It also goes to this issue, though, of why we have certain expectations of these traditional, highly regulated or maybe legacy formats, and then the Internet people get to do what they want. Yeah. So again, we come back to this issue. We need to have the same rules for everybody.
Well, and it increased cost, because a newsroom at, say, the Washington Post has to have more people in it than a Facebook algorithm to determine whether something has been double-checked or fact-checked and that kind of thing before it goes out on their platform. So again, it goes back into would you go to Facebook if it cost you 50 cents a day like a newspaper does to read it? And I guess that goes back into the maturation of the market.
Well, the Facebook at 50 cents a day would probably reduce their users. But I would also think that they could also change in the sense they could also create opportunities for them as well. But here's the other point. Even though I mean, I might be skeptical of what I read in the Washington Post for all the fact checkers that they have, given I know the stories they do in telecommunications, which are not based in reality. So,
I see your point.
I think this also comes to, we can't forget our role as critical human beings, that we have to maintain that. We cannot just outsource it all to the government, and that is what, this notion about fake news, it's nothing new. It's always been the province of any politician that they don't like what the media says and they want to call it fake. So that's been going on a long time.
Roslyn, I appreciate your thoughts on this, and it's going to be something that doesn't get resolved just in the course of a radio show. But at the end of it, with the revelation that the Obama campaign did the same thing that Cambridge Analytica did, perhaps even more so by targeting people and saying, send this information to 5 of your friends, and here are 5 that we've picked from your friends list. It still came down to those people could have said, no, I don't want to do that. So there's a certain amount of, if those people didn't want to, they didn't have to do those things. Right.
Yes. And that's the other part about, is it, we say the price of free, the price of your privacy is free shipping. We'd also, again, personally, I'm more skeptical. There's a lot of apps I don't use because, we're now more educated about it. It will be a process. We won't resolve it overnight. But it is important. We have to take into account a lot of these perspectives. And we also need to look to say, well, gee, what's been working to date? Was that really so great? Or, how do we need to evolve things? To be honest, the legislation on the Internet is quite outdated. It's the last time Congress looked at anything in privacy is 2009, and the last time we talked about the Internet was 1996. So things have evolved considerably, and it is appropriate at this time to address it again. It is a major question, and we need to weigh in as we the people, because the Internet companies are weighing in through their lobbyists. There's no doubt about that. They're getting their voices heard. They have been, and it's time for we as citizens to say what we have to say.
Well, as you pointed out very appropriately, I think Facebook's zeal for regulation is just so that it kind of can regulate out any competitors that come along. You wouldn't be in favor. A friend of mine wrote a column in which he referred to something possible as national public social media, something along the lines of NPR and PBS being promoted and taxpayer funded.
A nationalized platform. I've watched. So, what I like at least about to have the discussion, because at least you then get to have some understanding around why is it that, you can say the harm that some industries have to be regulated and not others, or why Facebook has had it so good, because they didn't have to go through all those things, right? So when you buy your contract from your ISP, you have a contract, right? It's very clear what has to be provided. There's not a contract that you make with Facebook. So
I see.
There's some value in that, and it isn't to say contracts can't be managed through competition law. They certainly can. You don't have to have a regulator to manage it. But that is something that's evolved over time, and there's a sense of trust with that. And it is also fitting that, maybe new services, they get some runway to try and get going, but over time they sort of fall into, okay, how do we manage this? This kind of, as we're just talking about now. But then that would go to the question, which we'd put on Facebook, okay, well, if I'm going to pay with my dollars, that, we might demand more, for example, or we want more functionality or whatever, right? It might be very different. And so that is kind of an unknown. It would be a wonderful experiment to have.
I think so, and I think you see it in cell services even. You can pay more and you get more minutes and more unlimited time and everything else. Does it concern you that some of the American federal government regulations and the government interactions over this seem to be more interested in tax collections than actually making sure that content is vetted and that these folks are not taking a free ride on us?
Well, so I can just say this. First of all, I think that there is a legitimate response from both sides of the aisle in Congress. They're very concerned about this. They're concerned for their constituents, and they want to appear to do something good Okay, so at least I give them that. Mm-hmm. They have an interest to, they'd want to respond. They may respond too quickly or overreact or what have you, but I at least give them that they're concerned for their constituents. But again, we have to, as we talked about this, Facebook could work it to its advantage. But why I think we need to watch this is that we make sure it isn't, to Facebook's advantage and then not to the other ecosystem like that. And this is what we had with Ma Bell. Remember? AT&T, of course, in the old days. Please regulate us so we could make sure we're the only company. Well, after 50 years, we found out the government overcharged people, and we couldn't buy your own telephone outside of AT&T, and we had to break it up. It was collusion between the FCC and the regulated monopoly.
Oh, yeah.
So we have seen that, and that was in airlines, we had that in shipping, we had it in railroads, all of those things. So that's the issue here around the importance of allowing competition, not just regulation.
Yeah.
So it is a tough call. There's no doubt about that. But that's, this is kind of a watershed moment. There's a tipping point here.
Well, and absolutely, and I appreciate your time, Roslyn Layton, and thank you for. And I'd like to circle back to this at future editions of the show and see where we're going with this. As this is just not the end of the beginning, but maybe the beginning of the end. Who knows? But I really appreciate it. Thank you, Roslyn Layton, from the former internet policy expert with the EU and Trump FCC transition team member this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Thank you all for tuning in this week as well. And again, you can find out more about us and our guests on our website, tertiumquids.org. But until that time, until we see again next weekend, for all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, my name is Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish.